it's been a head-spinning week for the global economy.
Tariffs are very powerful, both economically and in getting everything else you want. And they're going to make our country very rich again.
President Trump has pressed play and then pause on tariffs against Mexico and Canada. He's imposed fresh taxes on Chinese imports, and he's warning the European Union they're next. So are we at the start of a new 21st century trade war? Or is this telephone diplomacy, Trump style, and businesses and governments need to adapt to the uncertainty? And what exactly does Trump want from all of this? Let's try and find out. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, Trump's tariffs. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. Historically, tariffs, or taxes on imports, played a key role in the United States. They were used to generate revenue for the federal government and to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. Tariffs increased the cost of foreign goods, making American goods relatively cheaper. But in the early 1930s, two Republican lawmakers, Willis Hawley and Reed Smoot, imposed tariffs on thousands of imported goods. Other countries, including Mexico and Canada, retaliated, resulting in a trade war that economists believe exacerbated the Great Depression. Tariffs largely fell out of favour in the US after that. But in 2018, Donald Trump, in his first term as president, imposed import taxes on a wide variety of products, ranging from steel and aluminium to solar panels and washing machines. Beijing retaliated, kickstarting a US-China trade war. Now Trump is back in the Oval Office, and tariffs once again appear to be the policy tool of choice, not just for economic goals, but foreign policy ones too. The situation can change rapidly, as we've seen, and there's much we don't know. But if I was to pick anyone to help analyse a deeply uncertain, fast-moving situation, it would be Dan Burns, our America's economics editor. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Carmel. Good to talk to you.
You're pretty busy right now.
Just a little.
So Dan, tell us, Trump isn't the first US president to use tariffs, but is the use of them as like a kind of an all-purpose club for all sorts of policy goals, is that unique?
It's not entirely unique. Well, he has done it before, recall?
Mm-hmm.
He's at least used the threat before. In his first term, he did use tariffs against Mexico as a threat for demanding more assistance at the U.S. southern border. But the assistance again materialized, at least to his satisfaction, and no punitive tariffs were ever imposed on Mexico. But it is a certainly wider use of tariffs as a club to force negotiations around a range of issues than we've seen in really the modern U.S. presidential era.
One of the things that makes this so volatile is the fact that he's using tariffs to achieve all sorts of goals. So what's his end game? Is it to stop illegal migration and the smuggling of fentanyl? Or is it to end the US trade deficit with major trading partners, which is obviously a great sore spot for him? Like, do we know?
It's hard to disentangle them all because it's such a recurrent theme. He is very serious, I would say, on the other issues. And he sees this as a tool that he can use to essentially achieve a health and a U.S. foreign policy aim at the same time. But let's not forget that even though those two pretexts, the inflow of fentanyl and the flow of migrants across the U.S. border, were the explicit pretext for the executive orders and actions he's taken, every time Trump then speaks about it off the cuff and starts riffing, all of his other complaints about trade relationships come into the conversation. Canada was a great example this week when asked about that. He went on to say, they treat us badly. Our banks can't operate there. their agricultural markets aren't open to us. They make cars for us, but they don't buy our cars. So it's a litany that comes out time and time again and is really central to his complaint about relationships, not just with Canada, but he's spoken about who he wants to go after next. And he sees the trade deficits that we run with the European bloc and individual countries as something also that he wants to rectify.
And yet the team that he's assembling to work on these trade issues comes from the foreign policy world. It's interesting to see how that's evolving, right?
It is. It's fascinating. It's fascinating on that front. In his first term, it was really very much the economics team. It was led by Bob Lighthizer, who was then the U.S. Trade Representative, Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury, Peter Navarro, who is again there as a trade advisor to Trump. All were very active in this. What was announced over the weekend, White House officials said, was in part being led by Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State.
Right.
So that's a new dynamic that clearly sends a message that this is more than just satisfying economic complaints. There are broader, bilateral relationship issues that Trump wants addressed in these conversations, other than just a trade deficit, no matter how much big trade deficits nod his soul.
It's effectively diplomacy done through trade, right?
It clearly is. And you've seen some of the initial responses with the moves that won the reprieve for Mexico and Canada on Monday, pledges to reinforce the border. There's some argument to be made that these are actually not new outright pledges, but they happen to be made specifically on calls directly between these heads of state and Trump. And that seemed to satisfy him at least enough to win a 30-day reprieve. But it was those measures, which are non-economic, that won this initial pause.
Right. So, most economists think trade wars are a bad idea. What are the risks to the U.S. economy and its trading partners right now?
Well, put it in context. These Mexico and Canada are the two largest trading partners, well exceeding China now. China's now a distant number 3, but still important. So this would affect the flow of goods on everything from automobiles and oil, to agriculture products, a whole range of food and beverage products. So it could have effects immediately on not just on activity, but certainly on prices. A range of models are floating around from economists at banks and think tanks. Most kind of come in with the idea that it would chop U.S. growth by about 1.5 percentage points from what the baseline expectation is, and would add anywhere between a half percentage point to maybe a full percentage point to inflation in the near term. In the case of Canada and Mexico, most estimates are that it just throws them into recession outright.
Wow.
And then a number of U.S. states, for instance, have direct trading relationships with Mexico and Canada, on which they really, their local economies really thrive and depend upon. So there's real regional risk. You look across the northern border, places like Wisconsin, Michigan, southern border, Texas, Arizona, and California. All of those have a lot really riding on this.
So every week, as you know, we like to have a real-world example of what we're talking about. But the truth is, right now, we don't know if the tariffs against Mexico and Canada will be implemented, what others might be coming down the pike, and whether there will be retaliation. But we do know about the tariffs that have been levied against China. So I thought we'd talk to Kevin Krolicki, our Greater China Bureau Chief and a regular guest on this pod, about how all this is shaking out over there. Kevin, how has the Chinese economy weathered US tariffs so far?
If you go back to the first Trump administration and compare it to now, the macro picture really is that exports have continued to boom. External demand, that is to say, sales of Chinese-made stuff to people outside China, has really been the only bright spot for the economy. And you had a trade surplus last year of $992 billion. Just a staggering total. So in that sense, it hasn't, you haven't really seen a macroeconomic effect. At the same time, China's clearly sensitive to the threat. The reliance on external growth is a weakness, is a vulnerability. And I think it's clear that Chinese policymakers see an opportunity to do some sort of a deal, some sort of a transaction with Trump
Mhm.
And that's the focus.
But in the meantime, Trump has closed this trade loophole used by Chinese retailers like Shein and Temu to ship packages worth less than $800 duty-free to the US. What sort of fallout could this have in China?
So this has been under discussion for a long time, and yet the announcement itself came so quickly and the implementation was so fast that shippers and logistics companies, and no one was really ready for the change that's now taken place. You've got, in some cases, just a complete stop in shipments that will translate to a stop in transactions. For Shein and Temu, if you're a policymaker in Beijing, the bigger concern in some ways probably is their supply chain, because the minute you hit the brakes on those shipments, then you're putting people out of work. And jobs is always the most sensitive part of all of this.
So Dan, how did things shake out economically for the US from Trump's first set of tariffs? Like, what does the data tell us?
Well, it's interesting because it came over a slower period, right?
Yeah.
The first priority in Trump's first term was the tax cuts.
Mm-hmm.
That took pretty much the entire first year, 2017. And their enactment, evidence shows, did provide a bit of a tailwind for the economy. He then turned his focus to the trade negotiations with U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and then began the back and forth tariff exchanges with the Chinese in particular.
Yeah.
Those did begin to exert a bit of a drag toward the end of 2019. And you saw that in the response, frankly, of the Federal Reserve that year.
Right.
Federal Reserve had been raising rates through the first couple of years of Trump's term. He didn't like it, but the economy was strong, and they stopped that in late 2018. And you remember they had to deliver a couple of what they called mid-cycle slowdown reductions to safety valve type of cuts to U.S. interest rates.
Yeah.
They did that because there was really a measurable drag that was beginning to be seen from the trade frictions on U.S. activity.
Right.
And then, of course, suddenly we're at March 2020 and COVID comes and everything changes.
Right. In other words, COVID kind of messed up the data.
Absolutely.
Right.
And in fact, the phase one trade deal that was ultimately reached with China actually didn't go into effect until almost the eve of the COVID outbreak. And it has been one of those things that's been essentially set aside. It's in stasis.
Yeah.
China certainly has not delivered on its obligations in that deal.
And those obligations were basically to buy more U.S. goods, right?
Yes, it was unlike the USMCA, which was really about broadly about trade terms, USMCA being the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that replaced NAFTA. The deal with China was much more based on expectations of you shall buy our stuff.
Yeah.
And if you do, you'll avoid punitive tariffs. It was about quotas and meeting quotas, and China has not met those quotas.
Right. Dan, tariffs, am I right in thinking, have a habit of sticking around, right?
Sure do. These things do have a habit of getting embedded and become intractable. And you even saw that with Trump's trade terms, particularly with China in the end of his term.
Yeah.
The Biden administration, which shared very, very few policy visions with the Trump administration that preceded it, did nothing to alleviate the tariffs that had been imposed on Chinese goods by Trump, and in fact, in some cases, expanded upon them.
Right.
So it is something that, you're right, when they come in, they tend not to go immediately away because there becomes to be a constituency around them that often can have a pretty powerful voice.
Yeah. There's also the danger, isn't there, that because there's so much sort of uncertainty, that you could see perhaps companies, they're dealing with kind of randomly imposed tariffs. It makes it hard for them to plan. So we could potentially see investment shelved, right?
You could. I would just temper that by saying that pretty much every business survey we've seen since Trump was elected has forward-looking indications of stronger plans to invest.
Okay.
And that's because they see things like deregulatory and impulses from his administration as a counterbalance to some of this more turbulent and things around trade, the trade uncertainty. It has clearly already changed some behaviors in advance, where in December, we saw the largest goods trade deficit on record. And there was clear evidence that companies and consumers were front-loading some forms of consumption to try to get ahead of the tariffs. So you saw a bumper month and a strong year overall, a bumper month in particular in automobile sales in the United States in December. Well, guess what?
Yeah.
They fell in January by the most in more than 2 years. If that holds, that's stolen consumption from down the road, and we'll be looking for more evidence of things like that.
Right.
But it's pretty striking.
Yeah.
That's a pretty striking example.
Then you think of the US trading partners. I mean, Trump's actions are encouraging nations to try and find other routes for their trade, right?
They are, but again, it's a little bit around the edges.
Okay.
Because the center of gravity in global trade is still the United States as an importer. It's China as the world's exporter, and it's the United States as the world's largest importer.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to see how anybody thinks that they could put together a trading bloc that makes up that gap.
So I think the probably one of the few things we can say for certain is that the outlook is volatile for the global economy. Like, what does that mean for markets, like for consumers, for central banks?
That's the big question, in policymaking front.
Yeah.
We've seen the repeated refrain from Federal Reserve policymakers just in the last month about high uncertainty, about there being no need to rush for additional rate cuts.
Yeah.
So it could mean a circumstance where unless something else really begins to break, the employment market, or there really is a sudden slowdown in growth. But until you see that, you have kind of the ingredients for a Federal Reserve to be on hold, at least until the summer. And that means financial conditions are not going to ease in the way that is conducive to fueling further growth. We saw Q4 GDP come in less than expected. Most estimates are that we're not going to see a big rebound in the first quarter, particularly with all the turbulence and the volatility around the way trade impacts U.S. gross domestic product. So that's all stuff to watch. The real economy impacts are not going to be visible for all this volatility for some weeks and months to come. But certainly policymakers are having to respond. And right now, in the U.S. at least, they're responding by kind of sitting on their hands saying, folks, you're not going to get the rate cuts that you thought you might get, at least in the near term. While others, Canada, Mexico, ECB, they are having to be much more defensive in posture and are having to lower interest rates a bit more than possibly they'd like.
Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk in what is, a really busy time for you. I really appreciate it.
Happy to have done it, Carmel.
A big thank you to Dan, Kevin, and everyone covering trade at Reuters. You can read their up-to-the-minute coverage on Reuters.com or the Reuters app. Sound design, composition, and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Jonah Green, Christopher Walljasper, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Lila de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.